Good afternoon, class. This is our presentation for the French Revolution. I'm going to put this presentation up on YouTube later for you guys in case you need to look at this for notes or to help you study for the test. So, let's go right into it. So there are several causes of the French Revolution. Some are long-term and some are short-term. Let's look at one of the long-term ones. The excesses of the monarchy before the French Revolution were extreme. Louis XIV, one of the most powerful monarchs in French history, built a palace by the name of Versailles, which was so elaborate and so beautiful that it actually became the standard of palaces during that time period. Because of this lavishness, it incurred a massive amount of debt. Also, Louis XIV was ambitious, and he wanted to consolidate France's power in Europe, and so he fought many wars to consolidate that power, and by the end of his reign, France was considered the superpower of Europe. Louis XIV's great-great-great-grandson, the 16th, was someone who did not fall far from the tree. By funding the American Revolution, he further increased France's debt, and when crises came along, like the famines of 1788 and 89, they were unable to help the starving French people. And so, Louis XVI called a commoner by the name of Jacques Necker, who was a trained banker and financial manager, who had many good ideas of how to solve the problem, but one of them including taxing the nobility. And that made the aristocracy quite upset, and they pressured Louis XVI into dismissing Jacques Necker. So by ignoring Jacques Necker, the government and the France itself was further weakened, and a political and philosophical movement that affected the revolution was the Enlightenment. This was a group of people who promoted rationale and reason and logic over faith, and they challenged older institutions like the monarchy and the church. So tensions begin to rise during famines in 1788 and 89, as I've mentioned, and we have two timelines that kind of show this period leading to the French Revolution, and both go through the French Revolution. One is from Marxist.org, and when we look at secondary sources and even primary sources, we have to acknowledge the bias that exists in secondary sources. And so this Marxist timeline, it is has a very positive evaluation of Jacques Necker and a very negative evaluation of Louis XVI. It also goes into far more detail. It uses different language, like we're using the word proletariat in the timeline. That's very different than using citizens or commoners. It's a strictly Marxist term. The travel guide timeline, however, is for a different audience. It's popular. It's shorter. They're more like bullet points than actual statements, and that's because the people who go into the travel guide timeline are not looking to learn about communism. They're looking to plan their trip and understand the country they're about to travel to. So Jacques Necker is called back by Louis XVI because of all these famines, and he advises Louis XVI to summon the Estates General, which is a parliamentary body like our Congress, but it hadn't been summoned in 200 years in France. We're going to look at the population there in a second, but notice that 96% is one estate. So the first estate is the clergy, and they could tax the commoners. The second estate was nobility, and they also could tax the commoners. And the third estate were the commoners, or the bourgeoisie. And you see that there's a big disparity between the population and the estates, and this is their representation in the Estates General. Even though 96% of the population are commoners, they only get a third of the representatives. This obviously is unfair to them, and this shows up during the Estates General. So, because the clergy and the aristocracy were fighting for a status quo to keep things as they were, and the commoners wanted something new, there was a deadlock. And this resulted in Louis XVI locking the third estate out of the deliberation. So the estate met in an indoor tennis court in Versailles where the Estates General was taking place, and they swore never to leave until they came up with a solution to the problem. And that meant by writing a constitution. And by August of 1789, that happened. Outside of Versailles, though, things were getting a bit more tense. Necker was dismissed because the aristocracy never liked him in the first place, and the supposed failure of the Estates General to come to a concise agreement worried Louis XVI. So this dismissal incited anger, especially in Paris, where a mob of Parisians stormed the Bastille. July 14th is always considered Bastille Day in France. It's like the 4th of July here. This mob, the Bastille, was a building that symbolized the monarch's authority in France. It was a prison, and the mob took it down brick by brick to show the demolition of the Bastille, of France's power. Another event that happened was an advisor asked Marie Antoinette, "Why are you letting these people suffer?" And apparently, Marie Antoinette said in response, "Let them eat cake." Now, had Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI's wife, actually said that, that would enrage many people. But most historians agree that she did not say that. It still upset many people. The women of Paris marched over to Versailles and demanded that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette travel to Paris. And so Louis XVI is effectively trapped in Paris then, and he's also forced to acknowledge the Constitution that the National Assembly has written. And that Constitution is the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And so here's our text of the Declaration. It's far more radical than the United States Constitution, and we're going to look at why. So this Article 4 is a very clear definition of what freedom is, and it's a very broad definition of what freedom is. It's kind of a to each his own. As long as you don't hurt anyone else, you're allowed to do whatever you want. You can grow beans wherever you want, which would be almost very hard to imagine in France at that time. And the 13th article calls for a redistribution of wealth, which is something that was never even considered in the United States Constitution, and it's an idea that influenced Marxism or was included in Marxism almost a century later. And the 6th article talks about every citizen's right to participate personally. That's far more broader than democracy was initially in America, because only wealthy landowners could vote in America. Every male citizen, every male in France had the right to vote. So this is the first document the first of many constitutions that exist during the Revolutionary period. And like America, they developed political parties in France. It's divided into left and right, like we have here and we had back then. Royalists were people who were more conservative. They supported a constitutional monarchy. They wanted King Louis XVI to still have some degree of power. On the opposite end, the Jacobins believed in a republic. They were against the king in general, and they become very important later on during the Terror. And then they were part of the group called the sans culottes, and that means without culotte, which is a type of pant that was worn by the aristocracy. You know, those knickers that go up to your, just below your knee, and they would never wear those. They would never be caught dead wearing those, and that's why they were called the sans culottes. And then we have the Girondins, which were moderate Republicans, and they were the government that was in power before the Terror. And the Reign of Terror was a response to many things. Many countries in Europe hoping to overthrow the new government and reinstall Louis XVI invaded France. It was discovered that Louis XVI was in support of all these invasions, and so he was sentenced to death by guillotine and was found guilty of treason. And the Terror existed and lasted for 2 years, and it was led by a man by the name of Maximilien Robespierre. The guillotine, which is almost the symbol of the French Revolution, it was the primary means of execution because it was seen as the most humane means of execution. when someone was accused of counter-revolutionary activities, is that it would be thinking almost against the revolution, thinking that this might not be a good idea. They were sentenced to be judged by a tribunal of their peers, quotation marks, and if they were found guilty, they would be sentenced to death. And during this time, over 16,000 people were killed by guillotine, and 25,000 were killed through other means. So the terror doesn't exactly work out. The French people, it becomes extreme. It becomes a witch hunt. People eventually accuse Maximilien Robespierre of counter-revolutionary activities himself, and he is executed by guillotine. So the government that replaces the reign of terror is known as the Directory, and it lasted 4 years, which you would think is relatively stable compared to the governments that existed before it. However, it existed very anemically. It was very weak. It was almost constantly under threat of coup by the military, and several times was saved by a man by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. This was organized a lot differently than the French government, than the earlier French government. There were 5 directors above, and then 2 houses, assemblies, if you will, below them, and the directors voted on all legislation, and that worked out just fine until 1799. And it's different. This one is far different than, say, the earlier governments because it was very conservative. The extremism of the leftist Jacobins really affected the voters and the people who represented them. They were not willing to execute someone for the basis of means or being against the revolution. They just kind of wanted to survive. The revolution almost soured in their mouths. And so the results of the revolution, there are many. It is almost like a earthquake, a tidal wave of effects throughout Europe and throughout history. Napoleon's rise to power. He was elected consul in 1799, and eventually, a few years later, he was coronated emperor of France. And this Napoleon becoming emperor is the official end of the French Revolution, considered the end of the French Revolution. And Napoleon himself had a very, very powerful and immediate effect on European history because of all his conquests. The French Revolution resulted in the restructuring of politics around Europe, though not many other monarchies fell during the French Revolution or during that period. They had to make many concessions because there was so much unrest in response to the French Revolution. If they can have it, why can't I? And so people ended up getting more liberties in Europe, and then effectively because Europe controlled a vast majority of area around the world. And then nationalism. Now that people had a say in what their government was, they could take pride in the actions of their government, and they began to identify themselves by national borders. And nationalism is an idea that pervades European history throughout the 19th and 20th century, and also, ultimately leads to a lot of its problems, like World War I and II. And you have to think about how was this event similar or different to the American Revolution? They use the same name, and you would think that the American Revolution is quite important because it happened before the French Revolution. But the American Revolution was a secession, and also was across the Atlantic Ocean. It didn't have a direct effect on the politics of anything in Europe. The institutions that had been in place before the American Revolution, like slavery, the South's political power, still existed after the Revolution. However, the French Revolution completely changed the fabric of not only French society, but European society as a whole. So, thank you very much, guys. Hope you guys took good notes, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.